Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing incredibly well, and I hope you're ready to listen to part 2 of our story. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back to the description and listen to part 1 because you don't want to miss it. So let's continue with part 2. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with our story. I tell you what, sweetheart, how about you pour me a lovely cup of candy floss tea? I say to my daughter. Did you hear that, Mrs. Penbrook? My mum wants candy floss tea. I lift up the plastic cup to my mouth and say, this is very tasty tea, Sophie. Now tell me, Sophie, why don't you ask Mrs. Penbrook why she's here with us in the house? She says she's looking after you. And me. She says she's protecting us from the big bad man. She wants you to have a safe pregnancy. She says she's going to look after you and she's going to look after me. Bad man? Who is this bad man? I ask. Mrs. Penbrook says he worked with the horses. She said he killed her, buried her under the old oak tree. She says he's still there, that he still wants to hurt you, but she won't let him. She won't let him. I am so confounded by my daughter's extraordinary revelations that I decide to do some personal investigation all of my own. I discover that in the 1800s there's a report in the Evening Democrat newspaper referring to a missing woman called Constance Penbrook, who had vanished from her home without a trace. I discover that Mr. and Mrs. Penbrook had lived in our original farmhouse on our land. She had birthed 8 children here, 2 that had died during childbirth. It was tough in those days, I imagine. Many women died during the throes of childbirth, from conditions like postpartum sepsis, puerperal fever, hemorrhage, eclampsia, high blood pressure, and even an obstructed labour. Why was Mrs. Penbrook in our house, claiming to be watching over me to keep me safe? Safe from what, I wondered. Of course, I tried to discuss my absurd, outlandish findings with my very cynical, more than a little sceptical husband, but he dismissed everything I suggested out of hand. He told me I was talking absolute nonsense, and there was no such thing as ghosts, that my daughter was just playing with an imaginary friend, as girls her age often had imaginary friends. But I knew different. I knew Mrs. Penbrook was real. Let's just say after the idiosyncratic, enigmatic event that had occurred at my daughter's make-believe Dolly's tea party, where I'd been privy to enjoying a fictitious cup of candy floss tea, and been somewhat introduced to an invisible entity that I couldn't actually see, but could certainly sense and smell, as Mrs. Penbrook herself smelt very strongly of lilacs. Let's just say I was on high alert in my home, watching out for any signs of paranormal activity. My efforts were often rewarded by the sound of a female flowery enervated laughter that could be heard bounding up and down the corridors, floating on the upper landing, and of course serenading Sophie in her bedroom. The sound was most commonly accompanied by my daughter's appreciative giggles and happy commentary. "Oh, Mrs. Penbrook, you're the best! You're the best, Mrs. Penbrook!" Indeed, the sound almost became as commonplace and natural as hearing the kettle boil as it clicked off at the electric socket in the kitchen, or the sound of a low-flying aircraft humming over the roof of our home. I felt almost as if Mrs. Penbrook was watching over my daughter for me, keeping her highly entertained. Let's just say Sophie was a handful at the best of times, and as delightful as she was, she could exhaust you. She had an insatiable energy that was not easily satisfied or subdued. I would occasionally hear a woman's very elegant feet padding up and down the staircase, and even a rubber ball would bounce from the landing down the steps to the ground floor, all on its own. And there were a few isolated occasions when I'd been through a tough, tumultuous day, where I would find a rose often parked on my pillow. It really gave me a sense that this woman, Mrs. Penbrook, really had my back, and was taking good care of me. One day I was standing in front of my mirror, examining the full damage of my pregnancy, in a moment of brazen courage, while wearing my undergarments. I remember groaning out loud, "Oh my God, you look like a great big hippo," That's expecting triplets, hardly just one baby. And then I saw a woman standing there staring at me in the mirror, and I did a double take. She looked exactly like me, only wearing a Victorian dress, a silvery blue fabric with a floral impression. She was smiling at me broadly, and then she was gone like a flash of light. But I know I had seen her. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I amble over to my dressing table and begin to experiment with various different hairstyles with my long dark hair, piling it on top of my head, in a similar hairstyle to the ghostly woman that I'd seen in the mirror. And when I stare back at my own reflection, I almost do a double take. I look identical to Mrs. Pembroke. How is that even possible? The resemblance between the two of us is strikingly uncanny. We could quite literally almost be identical twins. 2 nights later, I'm lying in a careful position, under my goose-down duvet, my head propped up against a few comfortable pillows. It must have been about 1 o'clock in the morning. The room suddenly becomes freezing cold, so cold that my own breath produces a vapour. Moments later, a cruel, gnarled, arthritic hand thrusts me down on my back, punching an intense pressure upon my chest. Thick fingers, icy cold, burn and sear into my skin. They're calloused. They wrap themselves around my neck and squeeze tightly, very tightly. I can barely breathe. I'm fighting and struggling for breath. Terror consumes my entire body. It pulsates through every vein. Its crippling effects only serve to incapacitate me all the more. I want to scream. I really do, but I just can't. It's like nothing emerges from the back of my throat, as if my throat has dried up like an old prune and is no longer operational. I feel almost as if my entire body is paralysed like a mouse, immobilised by a snake, exposed to its deadly fate, unable to fight back. It's that helpless, overwhelming, defeated feeling, of which I know I'm at the mercy of this malevolent entity, whom of course possesses no mercy. The strong scent of leather tack, hay and horse manure seizes my nostrils, along with a faint hint of whiskey. I open my eyes. I'd kept them tightly shut. I was terribly afraid of what my eyes would see, but I see nothing. I oscillate my arms vigorously, like a frenzied, desperate octopus dangling precariously on the end of a fisherman's spear. I try to wrestle with this powerful, invisible entity. I try to push him off with swift, jerky movements. I observe this billowing, dense, dark, smoky form hovering above my body. It's demonical, hostile in its frequency. Then in a second, I see this grotesque man's face emerge through the smoke, with eyes glowering at me, bright yellow eyes like an angry cat, that stare down at me with a vindictive hatred that is so palpable I can actually feel it. I can taste its bitterness, smell its repugnance. The man has a bodeful, gargoyle-like face that is so threateningly menacing. In that second I know this entity wants to kill me. He desires me to be dead. I can hear a hideous witch-like cackle emerging from the back of his throat. Then suddenly something snaps inside of me, as if the tightrope wound around my vocal cords has finally snapped. My mouth relaxes into a full-bodied scream. I scream, scream and scream. The bedside light switches on. My husband is shaking me. "Calm down," he says, trying to still down my frantic wiggling body that is still fighting this invisible entity back. But it's gone. So I find myself slapping my husband. He holds my hands tightly together and tells me to calm down. "Calm down, calm down. You've just had a very bad dream." His face looks overwrought and panicky. Has he sensed the entity too, I wonder? But if he does, he doesn't acknowledge anything, only says, "What's wrong? Was it a terribly bad dream? You were screaming very badly, lashing out at me. Are you sure you're all right?" "Oh, don't worry about me. I'm fine. Like you said, it was just a bad dream, that's all." I really didn't want to tell my husband about the demonical character that had exerted a forceful pressure upon my chest, that had tried to kill and strangle me. I knew telling my husband this would seem ludicrously bizarre, It wasn't a good idea. Maybe he'd think my pregnancy brain had turned to mush and was subjecting me to all manner of hallucinations. He had been commenting more recently on how clumsy and uncoordinated I had become of late, breaking everything I touched and forgetting things all the time. I would think such allegations, if I heard them from my husband myself, were preposterous, so the last thing I wanted to do was to invite my husband's scepticism and disbelief. I don't want his doubts to cloud my judgment, to make me disbelieve what I've seen, or to escalate an argument between the two of us, whereupon my husband would naturally insist it had all been just a bad dream. It was better to keep the peace, to say nothing at all. I knew what I'd encountered was real, and that's what mattered. I don't know how I managed to fall asleep that night, but against all the odds I do. And that is when Mrs. Pembroke herself enters my dreams, with a reassuring voice. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. It won't happen again, I promise. I hear her whisper this into my mind. I'm not sure that my dream is wishful thinking on my part, but the unfeigned dream was as vividly lucid and as authentically sincere as when I'd seen the ghostly figure of the woman that reminded me of myself, staring back at me through the mirror. I know what happened to me was no fabrication. The following morning the bitter truth is cruelly affirmed when I examine the horrifying trail of black fingerprints around my neck that depict the very distinct finger marks of a man. I'm so startled to see the poignant evidence staring at me blazingly in the face. I run my hands across my neck, knowing full well that everything that happened last night was definitely not in my imagination. But I choose to conceal the evidence from my husband. I've never kept secrets from him before, but I'm too exhausted during this pregnancy, too fatigued all the time, that invoking an argument of any kind is the last thing I need. I just don't have the energy for discord in my home. Besides, I know my husband would become very distressed and discomposed if he saw the black finger marks around my neck. I'm not sure he'd know what to make of them. I would sooner bite the bullet to keep the peace than say something to fuel a debate. My best friend Anastasia, for example, is married to a man who does not possess the same political allegiances as she does. They both support different political parties, and they somehow manage to make their relationship work by biting their lips and restraining themselves from challenging each other in politics. My friend describes her husband as fast asleep, and her husband describes her as a conspiracy theorist who is seeing things that aren't actually there. Personally, I'm heartily glad that when it comes to politics, me and my husband are on exactly the same page, as quite frankly it's easier to live in a house where peace reigns supreme, without unnecessary conflict. Is life not hard enough already? After I return from my visit to the gynecologist, he's exceedingly happy with the progression of my pregnancy and tells me I'm about to drop, and that in a couple of weeks I will surely give birth. My husband announces to me he's going to be out of the country for a few days, which is not what a heavily pregnant woman wants to hear. But why, I ask? Why can't you wait until after the baby is born? Why now? I'm sorry, sweetheart, says my husband, grabbing me lovingly in his arms and giving me a generous hug. This is a business trip. It can't be avoided. But you need not worry. I will be back in time for the delivery of our baby. I wouldn't miss that for the world. Oh, it's just because I'm a big clumsy klutz, that's all I complain. I waddle around the place like Donald Duck. I've broken so much china and glassware recently. I can't tell you how many times I've held a glass that's literally slipped out of my hand and crashed onto the floor, breaking into thousands of pieces. My husband looks rather concerned. He scratches his head of dark curls reflectively. Why don't you get your sister Doris to stay over here with you while I'm away? I'm sure she would be good company for you. She would help look after Sophie as well, and manage the dinners. No thanks, I say. I love my sister, but in small doses. She has the propensity to be quite bossy, even though she means well. I can just see her ordering me around, telling me what to do the whole time. I don't need that. Very well, as long as you're absolutely sure. On the subject of my daughter Sophie, she was very thrilled about the prospect of becoming a sibling, and also with the upcoming delivery of the baby. She was constantly fondling my stomach and chuckling all the time. Mrs. Pembroke says you're going to have a baby girl, so I'm going to have a sister. She says you should call it Florence. This is news to me. I have no idea what sex my baby is, as my husband and I had firmly decided we didn't want to know its sex until it graced us with its presence on the day it was born. Why does Mrs. Pembroke want me to call it Florence? Do you know? Because that was the name of her first baby that died. At this revelation, my blood runs cold, as I reflect on my research and how I discovered the original owner of the house that resided here, Mrs. Pembroke, had indeed had 2 stillbirths. My daughter didn't even know any of this. The following night I retired to bed early. I decided I would read a book, but my eyes became hazy and foggy. I was beginning to yawn. I knew I could barely stay awake. It was late in my pregnancy, so getting to sleep was always a major accomplishment. As any heavily pregnant woman will tell you, sleep can be a tumultuous challenge, as finding that perfect position is never easy. But on this occasion I was so knocked out. I was literally out like a light. It must have been at about 12 o'clock at night that I awoke with a start, almost as if someone had poked me very hard in the back with a forceful finger. My bladder was now stinging with fullness, as the weight of the pregnancy places a heavy pressure on the bladder, so regular visits to the loo go with the territory of carrying a big bump. I knew I needed to go to the loo, and this ablution needed to be attended to at once to avoid an accident. I groaned with frustration. I felt like a really old lady, as I manoeuvred what seemed like a cumbersome, uncooperative body to do my bidding. It wasn't exactly very obedient. I was using my elbow to heave my bumbling form up onto the pillow, pushing myself into an upright position, until for a brief moment I was staring around a bleak, tenebrous-looking room. Indeed, it was so dark that all I could distinguish were the cardboard-like black cutouts of our furniture, the stocky upholstered chairs, the delicate chaise lounge, the dresser and the large shelving unit that framed the far wall. I discerned the dark velvety navy blue curtains were billowing against an open window that had invited a refreshing cool breeze to blow into the room, which kicked the curtains against the rails, making a slightly unsettling squeaky noise. A chill ran down my spine, as although I didn't see anything, something didn't feel right about my room tonight. It was then that I smelled the familiar scent of horse manure, hay and leather tack. That was like a red warning siren, blaring through my head like a screaming ambulance, demanding my immediate attention. For a second, my need to attend to my ablutions is postponed. I have to get out of this bedroom as fast as I can. The urgency is all-consuming for me. The last time I smelt that scent, a diabolical, fiendish, satanic-like being had tried to strangle me. It couldn't happen again. It just couldn't. I couldn't go through that again. For a second I see a dark silhouette racing past the underside of my door. It freaks me out. I'm now so filled with terror. I feel as if I'd been punched in the face by a kickboxer thousands of times. My heart is thundering in my chest, booming so hard. I feel every vibration, while my whole body is shaking precariously, my knees trembling, struggling to hold up my entire body weight. It's almost as if I could fold over like a camping chair. I stumble out of my bed in the darkness, bundling towards the sweeping staircase on the edge of the passage, heaving a huge sigh of relief as the passageway is bathed in a soft light. My heart continues to thunder as the smell of the horse manure is getting stronger and stronger. I proceed to heave my oafish body down the stairs, one foot after another. When I'm halfway down the stairs, 2 firm hands push me over with a heavy jerk, and my whole body jolts and plunges down the staircase, rolling to the bottom, where I land on a Persian rug in a crumpled, bedraggled heap. I am groaning in pain. Oh! 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 Every part of my body is swimming in aches. The pain is unbearably excruciating. There are no words to describe it. It is then that I see this whirling, black, dense smoke, billowing down the staircase like a black cluster of rapidly moving energy. I know exactly what it is. It's the very same mist that hovered threateningly over my body a short while ago, when that ghostly entity had tried to strangle me. For a fleeting second the smoke has morphed into a figure of a very cantankerous man, with a deadly expression on his face.
I'm convinced this is the evil entity Mrs. Pendlebury has been protecting me and my daughter from. I suspect that this ghostly entity was behind her disappearance in the 1800s, when she vanished off the face of the earth without a trace. The very man my daughter had referred to that buried Mrs. Pendlebury under the old oak tree. All of a sudden I hear a man's voice tickling my ears, as if someone's lips are pressing against them. I hear the hoarse, raspy words of a male voice scream, "Get out, Constance! Get out!" The ghostly entity has called me Constance. I know why, of course, as I had a fleeting glance of Constance Pendlebury once, and she looks exactly like me. So that's why the ghost wants me out. I remind him of Constance. If he killed her, why will he not do the same to me? My whole body is gripped with a dismaying anguish that I am not capable of articulating in words, but it speedily propels me through the house like a NASA space rocket. I couldn't get out of the house fast enough. I vaguely remember running, fumbling urgently with locks, breathing heavily, dashing towards the red barn. I wish I could say in those moments I was thinking about my daughter Sophie, tucked away in her bed fast asleep. But I was so consumed by my own terror that my survival instincts kicked into gear, and all I could do was race towards that red barn. But even before I got there, a tsunami of water pours down my legs. I know what this is. Bloody hell, my waters have broken. What am I supposed to do now? I can barely call for help, and there is no way I can possibly go back into the house right now. Not when a demonical entity has kicked me out. I'm too afraid to go to my daughter, but in my gut I know she's not in danger. It's me this vindictive being is after. And besides, Mrs. Penbrook has her back. I creep into the barn, grateful for the night light that is always left on in the barn, and although it's very faint and subdued, it's sufficient enough for me to make out the shapes in the barn. I clandestinely crouch behind a couple of old feeder barrels full of oats and molasses, abandoned by the previous owners for some reason. I think I can guess why. All of a sudden I feel my whole body clenching, groaning, heaving. As I go through electric spasms, I feel this burning desire to push. I clutch my stomach tightly. Oh my God! I can't be having my baby! Not prematurely! Not here! That's not possible, is it? I think falling down the staircase has brought on my contractions. But this is a week before my due date. This can't be happening now. I hear a strange banging noise and nearly jump out of my skin. Could that ghostly entity have followed me into the barn? Please, God, no! My heart hammers violently in my chest, but I sigh with relief, almost smiling and laughing to myself, when I realise about over 8 raccoons are stuffing their faces with horse feed. They've spilled out of the barrel for themselves. One raccoon is on top of the barrel and continues to spill more feed onto the floor below for his buddies to retrieve. I hear the creatures chewing hungrily, and then suddenly I see a large silhouette enter the barn. The raccoons immediately scurry away, as fast as they possibly can, sensing a predator is in their midst. I am now crippled by my own physical pain, but also by a personal terror. This thing, whatever it is standing there in the doorway, is terrifying. In the darkness I see a yellow eye shine 8 feet off the ground, and this hefty, stocky shape. What the hell is that? Please no, not another demonical entity, is it? The next thing I know, daggers pound my insides, as if I'm being stabbed 1,000 times over. I let out some agonizing shrieks, and then there he is, standing over me, looking down at me, with a bewildered, nonplussed, rather bemused expression on his face, as if I was the last thing he expected to encounter in the barn. Raccoons, yes. Horse feed, yes. But me, certainly not. The large creature's face catches the light. I realise that this is no demonical entity. It's actually a Bigfoot. But I don't know whether to be relieved or to be dismayed. Before I can react to this nonsensical Bigfoot, he whistles loudly. Another Bigfoot enters the barn. She's female. The two creatures begin to talk to each other in a strange, rather foreign language, which includes lots of clicks. They speak backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. I realise they're discussing me intently. The male nods. He glides away. The female Bigfoot takes over. She's looking down at me, Her treacle-coloured eyes emit a yellow eyeshine. She points at my belly and herself, raising 2 fingers. I think she's telling me she's had 2 babies. She's experienced at giving birth, and she's going to help me. I nod, knowing that this creature is not here to harm me. I can sense she wants to help me. She's showing me how to breathe by demonstrating long, slow breaths. I follow her lead, and her deep breathing exercises rarely help me. The Bigfoot's bent down on all 4s. She cleans an area of the barn, sweeping the dust away on the floor as quickly as she can, with an old cloth she finds lying over a large bucket of white enamel paint that appears to have dried up. She cradles me up in her arms, as if I'm as light as a toy poodle, and places me gently onto the cleared spot. Every time I groan and wince in pain, cowering under its attack, she talks to me in an encouraging voice. It sounds so poetic. I look into her beautiful eyes. They are warm and kind. She offers me her hand to squeeze every time I'm in the grips of agonizing pain, and when I squeeze tightly, she doesn't even flinch at all. I can't say I'm really surprised. She's huge. I'd say she's easily over 7 foot tall, 600 pounds, finely covered with long silky hair that smells like a flowery meadow. Her head is slung low on a pair of humongous shoulders. I'm struck by how human her face is, and how terribly concerned she is about me. There is no doubt she really cares about my welfare. As strange as this may sound, I feel as if I'm in the safest, most experienced hands that know exactly what they're doing, and I have nothing to worry about, so calm descends over me, like a cooling wave. This Bigfoot female has given birth in the wild before. Without the intervention or help of doctors, nurses, or midwives, she's going to help me through all this. I haven't got a choice in the matter anyway. My baby is coming out. The luxury of choice has been expunged from me. The Bigfoot pulls my nightdress above my legs and is inspecting between them, becoming incredibly excited, indicating that she can see the head, and with her hands that I need to push still more. Finally, with further pushes, out comes my baby. It just slides out of my legs, and the Bigfoot pats the baby's back. We're rewarded with a loud cry. She wipes the baby clean of its blood with her long fur and hands it back to me. Then she attends to the umbilical cord. And once the baby is born, 40 minutes later or so, the placenta finally comes out. And the Bigfoot is asking me if she can have the placenta. And I giggle and nod, realizing that she actually wants to eat it. The Bigfoot whistles, and the big male appears. Both of them take turns in holding my baby, bobbing it up and down in their overlong arms, like proud parents. They are so excited about my baby. They are thrilled about its birth. I think for both of them, being involved in my daughter's birth has brought us together as a team, an unlikely team, and there is a connection birthed between the 3 of us, along with my baby. It's incredibly special. The friendship between us can never ever be severed. They clap me on the back again and again to say well done. And they finally get me to my feet, walking back with me side by side to the house. At the time, my joy of giving birth to the baby is so immense that I forgot about the dark entity that could still be lingering around my property. The Bigfoots continue to clap me on the back, looking into my eyes as if I'm some kind of unheralded hero. They cuddle my baby again and again. They love my baby. The female Bigfoot reads my mind. I hear her whisper into my subconscious, "Dark energy, it's gone. Safe now." I feel reassured that it's safe to re-enter my property. But how was she able to speak to the depths of my mind? It's incredulous, but tonight has been so full of surprises. How can I be shocked by anything ever again? I watch them gliding away, talking excitedly to each other non-stop, backwards and forwards. No surprises for guessing what they're talking about. They speak with an effervescent ebullience. Much like me, this is a night they're unlikely to ever forget, as long as they live. When I return to the house, the energy is definitely benign, warm and loving. I feel safe to re-enter. I attend to my baby's needs, and then to Sophie, and then finally I fall fast asleep, after an exhausting night. Of course, after a check-up at the hospital the following day, I waste no time in informing my husband that I've given birth to our baby girl, at home, omitting the horrifying details that I gave birth on a less than pristine barn floor, layered with fine silvery silken cobwebs, fine dust, and a scattering of grain, with the help of a female Bigfoot. I'm not exactly sure how you'd have taken that revelation, so I decide to spare him the details. Besides, would he really believe that a female Bigfoot helped me deliver my own baby? I'm not sure if the boot were on the other foot, I would actually believe him, as in truth Bigfoot's existing here in North America was not something I felt even was a genuine possibility. But I stand now corrected. My husband's voice on the end of the phone sounds more than a little ruffled. You gave birth at home, all on your own? I don't understand. Why on earth didn't you call the emergency services? Are they that unreliable? It was too late for all that. The baby slipped out. Well, why didn't you call them after the baby was born? Surely you needed their help. I was tired. You managed to cut the umbilical cord on your own and deliver the placenta? Yes, everything. I'm sorry, sweetheart. It must have been terrifying giving birth all on your own without me. I don't understand how you had the baby premature. It wasn't due for another week yet. I feel I've let you down. You must have felt awfully alone. I smiled to myself, as I know I was far from alone. That female Bigfoot was the best nurse I've ever had. The next morning I watch a large Range Rover parking outside my property. A petite woman climbs out of her car and stares up at the house for a long while, taking it all in, as if she's soaking up the energy of the house. To my amazement, she's waving up at the upstairs window of my house, as if seeing someone she knows, but no one is there. My daughter is with her nursery group, so she's certainly not waving to Sophie. Could she be waving at Mrs. Penbrook? It would seem so. I can discern the click-clock sound of her shoes trotting to our front door. I open the door. A blonde woman is standing there, with short bobbed hair that gracefully licks her shoulders, complemented by a neat square fringe that covers her forehead like a silken curtain. I discern she has a heart-shaped face and pretty bear-like brown eyes. She's slender and petite, with a graceful gait, rather like that of a ballet dancer, making me conspicuously aware of how large I am. I do hate it when other people around me make me feel like a beluga whale in their group. She was not what I was expecting to see. I'm not sure what a psychic is supposed to look like. I thought she might be dappled with some New Age tendencies, like spiked hair and stuff like that. But this woman looks amazingly normal. Thank you for coming, I say. I really appreciate it. She nods at me, smiling at me warmly. Don't tell me a thing, she insists. I'm going to have a walk around your property, and then I'll tell you what I'm picking up. Righty-o, I say. I'll leave you to your own devices and prepare us some tea. That sounds great, she says. I like mine white with 2 sugars, please. I'm bustling around the kitchen preparing tea. I can hear the clunk of floorboards as she walks through different rooms, hovering over them for a moment, standing still, soaking in the energy. Then I hear her gliding down the sweeping staircase until her blonde hair breezes and bobs around the kitchen door. She smiles in at me. May I sit down, she asks. Be my guests, I say, handing her a hot mug of white tea. You live in a very beautiful house, she tells me. I pick up a very protective female energy that is very nurturing. Actually, she's a woman. I saw her earlier, waving at me from the upstairs window. She tells me she watches over you and your daughter, but that's because she's also related to you by blood, from way down the family line. She says the 2 of you look so alike, you could actually be mistaken for twins. I'm picking up the first name Constance and the second name Pemblebury. She tells me she was murdered in this farmhouse. Apparently there was a farmhand who worked on the premises, a man called Sidney Branning, who didn't take kindly to being ordered around by women. In those days they could get funny about stuff like that. She told me she was married to a loving husband, who left the managing of the horses in her charge, which was unusual in those days. I mean, it was the 1800s, and women were, let's just say, expected to be the demure sex. Constance tells me he was a lazy farmhand. She gave him his marching orders, sacked him, telling him he was no longer welcome on the farm. He was exceedingly affronted for having been dismissed by a woman, and hell-bent on getting his revenge. So clandestinely he returned one night, when he knew Constance's husband was away, and murdered her by strangling her to death and burying her under the oak tree in your yard. But he concealed the evidence so well that even Constance's husband never noticed the ground had been disturbed. Constance has already crossed over to the light, so she's not trapped here, but she watches over the house all the time, only because of the dark spirit of Sidney Branning hanging over this place. He is obviously a threat to you and your family, especially to you, given you look so like Constance. So he's not a demon, I ask? No, he's not a demon, but his angry, troubled soul has a very dark energy. You see, he's lingered here for many long years. I imagine causing chaos to many of the residents that have stayed in this property before you. I would be very surprised if anyone stays here for very long. The trouble is, he hasn't crossed over to the other side, you see. Once he died, he was terribly afraid to make that leap of faith beyond the veil, as he was so convinced he was going to hell. Constance has tried to help him cross over, but he feels it's trickery on her part, a chance to get her revenge on him. As she wants him to burn in the fiery flames, well, that's what he claims. By all accounts, when you moved into this house, you looked remarkably like Constance in every way. It was like putting the cat among the pigeons, or adding fuel to the fire. Your presence brought out an incandescent rage in Sidney Branning. You reminded him of his iniquity. We never like to be reminded of our sins. Constance clearly knew you were in danger. She says she's been watching over you and your little daughter. You do have a little girl. Yes, I do. She's 4 years old. I think Constance has been playing with her a lot. Constance was telling me that Sidney tried to strangle you, tried to push you down the stairs, so that you gave birth on your own in the barn. She says you gave birth to a little girl. She sent help for you, although whoever was helping you probably didn't know they'd been sent by her. Does that make any sense to you at all? Yes, it does, I say, nodding to the psychic, realizing that good old Constance had sent the unsuspecting Bigfoots my way, who helped me deliver my baby. Now we need to clear the house of this dark energy. We need to cross Sidney over to the light. So I want you to close your eyes after I light this candle and fill this room with light. And I'm going to persuade Constance to bring him over. Why would she want anything to do with the man after he murdered her? Forgiveness, dear. Constance knows that Sidney's a troubled soul and needs help. Once you've crossed over to the other side, you don't bear the grudges like we do on the earth plane. We both close our eyes, filling the room with light. He's very reluctant, says the psychic, but he is coming. I think his father is here to greet him. They're hugging. She opens her eyes. That's easier. Easier than I suspected. Much easier. He's gone with his father. As strange as it sounds, the house felt so much lighter. And even when my husband returned from his business trip abroad to be introduced to his baby daughter, he said to me, "This house feels very light, lighter than ever." To cut a long story short, I've only seen the Bigfoots one more time, when they passed the road, when I was in my truck. I wound down my window, and they chatted away to me nicely. I know they're out there in our wood grove, and there are only occasions where I might smell the fleeting scent of violets on the air. So I guess Constance does look in on us from time to time. But the dark energy of Sidney Branning no longer haunts this place. I did put a memorial stone underneath the oak tree, which reads, "In loving memory of Constance Pendlebury, who will never ever be forgotten." I guess she was grateful, as the very next day my room smelt strongly of lilacs, and there was a pretty rose left for me on my pillow. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.